that you have. It doesn't have to be a phobia, but any illogical thought that you recognize as being illogical, but you can't help it. So, for instance, I had a writer with writer's block, and I explained everything to him, because the key thing about how you develop a condition is that you don't feel in control. And therefore, I put the person in control. I even give them the choice to stop if they're too distressed. But bear in mind, if they stop because of their level of distress, they can make it worse, because they're now disengaging and stopping thinking when they're very distressed. Mm-hmm. And so far, nobody has stopped, because I give them the choice, so they're in control, and they start it because they want to get better. And what's fascinating about processing blocks is it's just like the brain is just like the body, really, in terms of little injuries that you get. So in the body, if you injure one part of your body, people often find, if they're regular gym goers, that they have knock-on little injuries in other parts of their body because they upset the musculoskeletal balance. And the same thing psychologically, little processing blocks start backing up and they start causing bigger problems. And therefore, what's really fascinating about the reprocessing is that when I start it with a client, they'll start with one image in their mind, which will rapidly dissolve with the treatment, and suddenly up pops a much more fundamental thought that they hadn't even been imagining about, because they buried it. And that's what had been affecting them in the first place. And that happens time and again. So, for instance, I had one person whose mother died. And she'd died after 2 bouts of cancer, and what an awful experience for the mother, for the family, really difficult, and yet she says to me, you know what, we said what we had to say. You know, I forgave her for things. She accepted me. You know what? It was actually a peaceful time. But she didn't grieve afterwards, and actually, it turned out the reason she didn't grieve was because if she grieved for her mother, she might have to think about the mortality of her father, and he's the person she really is close to and attached to, and that's what terrifies her, the potential mortality of her father. That never occurred to her, and that's what we're going to work on next time in our reprocessing. So if you know what you're doing, if you know the fundamentals of how things work, you can achieve fantastic results. So, I mean, this type of therapy, to put it in context, you can try and do the same thing with cognitive behaviour therapy, which is what most of the NHS doles out. But
well, you say doles out. Do you approve of it, or do you think it's bland, or does it work?
It works, but it takes 6 to 12 sessions to work at least, and we get the same results in 1 or 2 sessions of the reprocessing more effectively.
Does that because people just want to increase their billing hours?
So, no, it's well, the thing is, you have to have the presence and the confidence to do this type of therapy, and the thing about any kind of mass product is you need a product that is rapidly reproducible. So there's very few people like me who can do it to that level, but you need something which is measurable and with results. So CBT is something that can be fairly reliably reproduced because it's manualized, because there's a manual that the therapists read from, and you can fairly easily see the results and measure it, and therefore you can do your cost-benefit analysis.
There's also a few other things that I've seen, so I think it's called EFT, which is emotional freedom technique, which is about tapping into certain spots in your body or your face or things like this, and it's almost like this emotional acupuncture.
True, but bear in mind, again, well, that's interesting. That
because Paul McKenna does that as well, I believe.
That I think works similarly to the focused distraction, because you do it because you know you've got a problem. But it's not as effective because, of course, you're not being guided properly through it. Okay. So when I do this with a client, they take the power posture. I teach them the right breathing. I also use a mirror, because if you look in the mirror into your eyes, you are more rapidly aware of how you're feeling. I guide them through the process, and I use a line. I reel them in and reel them out if it's getting too difficult or it gets too easy. I keep them on track, and you need a very experienced professional to be able to do that effectively and reproducibly.
Okay. So how does one, if one's recognizing that they've got a challenge or they've got a problem, how does one start getting rid of their baggage? Obviously, the immediate answer would say, I should go and see your GP because they're not qualified to give any medical advice. But if someone wanted to sort of do some sort of DIY work on themselves, could they do that?
We're qualified but not licensed. But DIY, yes, you can. You're absolutely right, you can, because all too often in today's life we're on the treadmill, and there are two types of time that we don't give ourselves. Well, there are many types of time we don't give ourselves, but two types are processing time and planning time. And processing time is exactly that. It's time where you can just let your thoughts wander, let things churn in your head, and you can do that most easily in periods of mild distraction. So, for instance, going for a walk and thinking. And in fact, that's how Shapiro invented her technique. She went for a walk in the forest, but you can sit in a busy coffee shop and think. If you can go for a gentle run, as long as it's not too intensive, or a gentle swim.
And ladies, one of the things that men often do is when they're actually sitting down watching television, they're not actually watching television. That's called, I think the term is called fire gazing. Yes. Is that they're actually watching television because they're not really watching television. They're just watching the shapes because that's how they are processing certain thoughts. And so I think it's known as fire gazing. And
that's why...
And women as well, by the way, but men can be such slobs.
Yeah, and that's why, for instance, listening to the sea is... Because, again, listening to the sound of the sea can be very cathartic because it helps you process, because of the mild distraction.
Yeah.
And then there's planning time, and planning time is where you need absolute quiet, because you're engaging, you're voluntarily, consciously trying to think things through. So you mustn't have distraction for that. So processing time.
And that's like a form of meditation, is that?
It's not meditation. It's not form of meditation. You're actively thinking what's right for you.
Right, okay.
And you're making plans for it, so you mustn't be distracted. You must be in a quiet environment without distraction. So there's processing, where it's helped by mild distraction but not too much, and there's planning time, where you must be absolutely quiet and on your own usually.
Well, actually, one of the things I do, and I learnt it from someone, but I do with my some of my clients actually, when they're really unclear on what their vision and what their direction is to do some free flow writing. So, because we're so used to using the computer, we don't always actually use pen and paper. And sometimes it's just worth actually just writing for 20 minutes your vision and where you want to be. And even if it makes no sense or repeating, you just keep on writing for 20 minutes, even 30 minutes.
Processing.
Without stopping.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can dissect it afterwards to then chunk it down into your 1 minute spiel on what your vision is for the future, so you got a little more clarity.
100%.
But sometimes it's just worth getting a piece of paper and a pen, and just free flow write. Even just your thoughts. It doesn't even have to be your vision, just your thoughts, and then actually look at it afterwards and see what's actually come out of that.
The same thing after a relative dies. Therapists will often tell you to write a letter to your dead relative, and I used to scoff at that, but I would be surprised at how effective it was until I developed my reprocessing, and I understand exactly why it was effective. Mm-hmm. But going back to when we talked about emotions and logic, and of course millennials. In fact, there was a recent article saying there's a I think she's a writer or a journalist or something, and she's proud to be a sensitive millennial, and she said, "I'm proud to be emotional." And of course that's a complete catastrophe, because emotions rob you of self-awareness, and there's a very, very important distinction. In fact, exactly because people can be emotional, they don't end up being in control and doing what they want Okay.
Actually, I'll probably have to disagree with some of that. Actually,
let's follow my argument through, though. So remember, we respond to our emotions instinctually, reflexly, which means lack of conscious thought. So that's why we chase illusionary needs, and that's why more and more people are getting depressed and anxious, because they spend their life on the treadmill of instant gratification, chasing illusionary needs, never being in conscious control. And the amount of stress you have depends on the amount of control you have. So if you're not in control, you're stressed. And therefore, a very simple concept which needs hard work to practice is, you don't say, how do I feel about this? You say, what do I want? What, in the bigger picture, where do I want to go with this process? Once you decide where you want to go, then you choose to do what you do in the current time. So you end up doing what you want. And in fact, when I look at my baby son, who's 2.5, I notice he's always happy. Unless there's something specifically right then and there that he's unhappy about. Otherwise, he's smiling. He walks with his shoulders back, his head high, and that's because he never does anything he doesn't want to do. Now, of course, as adults, we can't do that, because there is always a bigger picture, which, of course, my baby son hasn't quite figured out yet. Well, at least not fully. So, give you an example.
From the eyes of the youth, from the young, eh?
Indeed. I'll give you an example. Say you've got to go and visit your in-laws, and you can't stand your in-laws. And you think, oh, I've got to go, and you're miserable. So that's the emotion that you're aware of. You're miserable, and you feel forced, and therefore you're out of control. You're stressed. And then think about the bigger picture. What do you choose? What do you want in the bigger picture? Do you want to have your partner be able to have good relationships with extended family? Do you want everything to be smooth? If you want that, then you choose to go to your in-laws, and now you're in control. So you're studying for an exam. You can either do it with fear of failure, which is what chasing an illusionary need is. In other words, because needs, if you don't get a need, what happens? You're dead. In the past, as a caveman, air, food, water, shelter, you're dead. So in today's parlance, it's a catastrophe. So I need to pass this exam. So you're studying with a fear of failure. And if you don't get it, it's a catastrophe. Whereas what's the bigger picture? If I want this career, I choose to study hard to pass this exam. And if you don't pass it, if you don't get a want, you're disappointed, maybe very disappointed, but never catastrophe.
You see, I mean, the thing is, it's very hard to control some of your emotions, because because you've got no control. You don't have any control over them. In effect, you can change it once you're aware of it, if you can actually give yourself enough time to actually logically process it.
But you can't. That's the trouble. Our system too goes down.
Of course you do, because the thing is, as soon as, like as I said, we talked about last week about the amygdala hijack.
It's power.
As soon as you know, that's hold on. That's the reptilian brain. That's been there for a lot longer than our prefrontal cortex, which actually provides our rational thinking process.
We did say you can damp down the amygdala activity by labeling the emotion. You can do that to yourself and to others. So you can say, that's an anxious thought, or that's an angry thought. As soon as you do that, the recognition of it, but not the involvement in it. This is the important thing. Just labeling, not involvement.
No, but once you're in that situation, that fight or flight, or it's actually freeze, fight or flight now. Actually, they've developed. But did you know what I mean? And this is where I wanted to dispute what you were saying about not being self-aware. And at the time, you can't be self-aware of your actions when you're in that emotional state. But sometimes the emotional challenges you can actually go through provide some of the biggest answers when you actually reflect on it afterwards.
Because reflect on it afterwards. What have you just done? By reflecting on it after.
Is this multiple choice?
No, we talked about it.
Go on.
You just said, as long as you reflect on it afterwards, sometimes you'll get to a conclusion.
No, you find the answers.
Try and process it.
You do process it, but the thing is, you sometimes have to go through that emotional state to be able to actually look back on it from an outside point of view. Almost looking into it and say, actually, why did this happen? And it can actually provide a lot more answers for yourself. And I do it all the time.
But that's it.
Because I ask myself, why did I behave like this, or why did I react? And I was because of this, and this. And when I can logically process it, then the next situation I look at, I've already got a solution to it that I'm in control of.
True.
To change that state.
But then and there, at the time, you were not self-aware. That's the trouble. You were highly emotional.